that was super good. So, the title of this service got me thinking when it was brought up in our group planning meetings. The "we're everywhere" part, especially. There are a lot of different ways to take that. One meaning could be that you never know who among us is queer, especially given how often it has been stigmatized. However, what catches my imagination is the idea that in a world where everyone is free to be their authentic self, how many would embrace some aspect of queer identities? Beyond that, while we think of queer rights only in the context of those directly needing relief from their lack, I find it interesting to consider how they benefit everyone. According to the recent history of Gallup polls, LGBTQIA+ self-identification has grown considerably in the US. It has risen from 3.5% to 7% of our population in the past decade. This alone is a stark increase, but it misses the more important part of the picture. The most significant change is seen in their breakdown of the generation-by-generation representations, where baby boomers and Gen X remain around 2 to 3% queer identified. Millennials are at 11%, and Gen Z is just shy of breaking 20%. Some of this comes from an uptick in identification as bisexual, but is an across-the-board increase. I think this shows that the trend toward queer acceptance is working. When and where I grew up, and I suspect for most of you as well, it was simply not okay to be gay. It was cooked into our every interaction, scrutinizing each other's actions for the slightest hint of it. The popular media used queer bashing as a ubiquitous source of humor. These days, it is undergoing a tectonic shift, with positive representations and role models in popular shows and books, and the jokes have become increasingly socially unacceptable. I think we see the result in the reduction of intergenerational internalized queerphobia. While bullying of those who come out remains a problem in our schools, allies are no longer a rarity, especially among the younger generations. They show support to one another, and in doing so, we're seeing so many grow up openly as themselves. Another perspective is in breaking down the barriers toward an open discussion of queerness. People have been able to expand and explore what the labels mean and how broad our experiences can be. This shows most strongly in the increase in bisexual representation, but we also see it in increased acknowledgement of the validity of asexuality, understanding that intersex people represent a normal and healthy part of the variety of human physiology, and in the spectrum of trans identities as we expand it beyond the 1980s picture of a strict swap of one gender for the other one. We have gender fluid folk, agender, bi, and demigender people, xenogenders, and many more than I really have a good handle on. I am still a product of my own generation, after all. But still, it dazzles me to see it. Sometimes, when I'm feeling the pain of not being born the way I wish I was, I like to consider the positive reasons transness could exist. I think it lies in our role in blurring the boundaries. We tend to lump all sorts of qualities and traits with the genders and with the sexes, justifying each of these by pointing at the strong bimodal correlates between anatomy and other parts of our lives. Motion towards acceptance, and especially visibility of trans people, helps weaken at all levels the idea that our biology dictates who we are and that most traits must be tied to one configuration or another. It's harder to really believe that when people are successfully defining their assigned role. It puts the lie to the rigidity of the thinking. And that's just the binary folk, let alone the non-binary transgender people. They soften and intermix the concepts even further, offering examples of the vast possibilities of human gender identity and expression. It's not to say that the gender binary or traditional understanding of it need deconstructing. They have a lot of value and importance to many people. However, they must remain or become fluid. It's part of the healthy functioning of a balanced society that the qualities and meaning of gender and identity remain open to change, to react to and evolve with the needs and imbalances in society. And it's hardly relegated to queer people alone. Queer rights are human rights, and they are important for everyone. The straightest, most cisgendered man can only benefit from the freedom to embrace his sensitive side, feel allowed to cry, be seen as nurturing and caring, or even to need emotional support. And of course, women benefit from any challenging of the rules which prescribe the destiny one's gender relegates a person to. And the bodily autonomy issues that surround trans rights help reinforce the all-important reproductive rights, and these battles are fought side by side. None of this is to say everything is rainbows. Bigotry remains, kids lose their families, and there's a massive wave of anti-queer legislation in our nation. Just a couple days ago, Texas joined the growing list of states that have entirely banned gender-affirming care for youth. And many states have varying styles of drag bans in place now. It's not great. But the point is that it's working. The efforts are worth it. The proof is in the happy youth free to express and to be themselves. In that 10% of millennials entering their 30s who are free to proudly declare themselves queer rather than spending adult years in an agonizing closet. The conversation has been moving forward, saving the lives of our children and grandchildren, and it helps all of us understand each other better besides.
Hi, I'm Jenny Yates. My pronouns are she and her. For millennia, newborn humans have been sorted into two genders and assigned roles based on the results. Males got to rule the world, and females were assigned to support them and create new people, preferably new male people. All across the world for millennia, this has been the tradition. But lots of people haven't felt comfortable in these tight boxes, especially when their assigned roles mean denying their attractions and desires. Patriarchy depends on the system, though, and patriarchy has always had weapons to enforce it. Weapons like shaming, shunning, berating, and as a last resort, the cold clash of the asylum gates and the prison doors. I know stories, and the roughest come from friends who are about a decade older than me. One friend, Marcia, has long memory lapses because she was locked up and given electroshock treatments when her parents learned she was gay. Another friend, Meryl, describes how people suddenly changed to a dance partner of the opposite sex when the bartender pressed the buzzer that signaled a police raid. I know many people who had to make hard choices during holidays because their families didn't want anything to do with their lovers. Those were the days when outing someone could completely derail a life. Their bosses could fire them, landlords could kick them out, and families could sever all ties. And so it's understandable that before I came out myself, I knew very few gay people. I'd spent my 20s mainly raising a child as a single parent, and now that my kid was a bit older, I had more freedom, and it was time to ask myself what made me happy. I wanted to be with women, although I didn't exactly realize how much I wanted to be with them. Lamas, the women's bookstore in DC, led me to some all-women groups, spiritual, political, and creative. I started to meet lots of lesbians, although at first I didn't recognize them as such. Back then, people didn't say it. At least for women, there were a lot of hints and a certain dropping of the names of lesbian musicians, and gradually we would figure it out. There were some, of course it helped if someone was wearing a button. There were some great ones back then. An army of lovers cannot fail, the future is female, out of the closet and into the streets, or even more explicitly, lesbians unite in armed snuggle, and dip me in honey and throw me to the lesbians. It was a heady time. When I finally got my bearings, I found a vibrant, exciting gay culture. It was rich with women's bookstores, publishers, festivals, music, political groups, magical circles. There was so much that was stimulating and new, ideas, inspirations, plans to change the world. There's a rush of energy that comes from knowing yourself, from recognizing the parts of yourself that society has tried to suppress, and from expressing feelings of love and desire. So this was one of the most joyful periods of my life, a joy that led me to Marie. She had a copy of the Crescent, the woman's newspaper, and she was looking for an all-woman event. When she walked into a room full of lesbians, she didn't have any doubts about who we all were. If I had been able to marry her legally instead of just symbolically in 1988, I probably wouldn't have spent the next 23 years outside the country. But it was easier for me to bribe the pertinent officials in Venezuela than for her to evade immigration in the US. We moved to Caracas and then Quito, and for decades we were both single in all our documents. But as the years spooled out, homophobia became less and less socially acceptable, and we were able to be more and more open. When she got a job in Germany in 2007, her boss actually suggested a domestic partnership, and we became legal partners for the first time. By the time we moved back to the US in 2012, we could marry, and I could sponsor her for US citizenship so that we can both continue to live here no matter what happens. I still feel some trepidation coming out in casual conversations, saying my wife as easily as a straight woman refers to her husband. But more and more, I do it, and I don't look for a reaction. At the same time, I came back to a world in which women's bookstores and festivals were on their way out. That vibrant community isn't so necessary anymore as gay people assimilate into the larger community. We're not so special anymore, but neither are we ostracized. We can speak the name of our love. We can live out in the open. All the code words have disappeared, replaced by just words. Love, marriage, wife, husband, family.
Thank you for that, Wildberry Jam. Imagine, if you will, a reality where humans are split into two groups. One group is classified as healthy, normal, and wholesome. Another is classified as unwell, abnormal, and sinful. A reality where some people are not only shunned for their existence, but criminalized and institutionalized for it. A world where medical professionals believe that a defining characteristic is a malady to be cured rather than a fact of someone's existence. No, I did not pull this concept from science fiction. I won't be reciting passages from Gattaca. What I am speaking about is our relatively recent past. We live in a world now where queer people are much more acceptable as regular members of society, and at times, especially for younger queer people, it seems hard to remember that the level of harm queer people had to endure ever occurred. Yes, we're often reminded by the far-right faction in this country, by their efforts to legislate us away, that we are different and non-traditional, whatever that means. But we are not typically afraid that our doctor might find out that we're gay for fear of being carted off to an asylum. Of course, there is an extremely different set of challenges for trans people, but speaking strictly about sexuality, we're mostly accepted. Let me ask a question of the congregation. Can anyone here tell me when homosexuality was no longer considered a mental illness in the United States? Does anybody know? You're warm over here. 1987 is the answer. Just for your knowledge also, homosexuality was not fully legalized in this country until 2003. Here's a second question for the congregation, just for sake of contemplation, especially for those of us who are under 40 in the room. I think it's important. If you were born before 1987 and you're willing and able to identify yourself, could you please raise your hand? If you've ever in your lifetime been told that you are sick or abnormal because of your sexuality, could you please leave your hand up? There are hands up. And I just want to say, as a community, we're here with you in acknowledging that history and that struggle. Thank you for that. Today is the anniversary of when that began to change. I'm going to recite a short queer history lesson, but please keep in mind it's impossible for me to cover everything in the short amount of time that I have before you. September 3rd, 1973 is the date when homosexuality was removed from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Illness, otherwise known as the DSM. If you've never heard of the DSM before, it is published by the American Psychiatric Association, or the APA, and it is the authoritative handbook on diagnoses of mental illness in the United States. Before this time, homosexuality was treated as an illness, and without going into too much detail, some of the treatments for that illness were ranging from social ostracization to downright barbaric practices. In 1971, Dr. Franklin E. Kameny, a gay psychiatrist and gay rights activist, along with a group of gay activists, openly confronted members of the APA at their annual convention and criticized the fact that homosexuality was listed at all in the DSM. He and numerous other activists continually interrupted this conference, gave speeches and protests. They cited evidence that homosexuality did not cause any real health issues for anybody, and that treatments for homosexuality did not work, and that in reality, the survival of these patients was much more likely if they were accepted for who they were. This happened over the course of that year and the following year at APA conventions. This led to an effort in 1972 by the APA to have a panel of discussions on the issue to better inform its members. There were a number of openly gay activists who were willing to sit on this panel and to discuss the topic, and a number of psychiatrists who were not gay who were willing to sit on the panel as well. But activists who were organizing it found quite a difficult time finding any gay psychiatrist who would willingly come forward to speak on the topic. Dr. John Ursel Fryer is the only person who was gay and a psychiatrist who agreed that he would speak on the panel. Because of the stigma he faced and the threat to his career, he agreed to only speak through a disguise. So, on May 2nd, 1972, Dr. Henry Anonymous appeared in front of the APA, wearing a mask, a loose tuxedo, a wig, and using a microphone that distorted his voice. I encourage you to look up the photo. It's kind of creepy, so I didn't include it. It's a very distorted Richard Nixon mask, which was already scary. It was this speech and the work of Dr. Fryer and other queer activists who worked with him from both within and without the APA that led to a vote of removal of homosexuality as a diagnosis from the DSM on September 3rd, 1973. This caused language to be replaced with a different diagnosis, and it wasn't until 1987 that all mention of homosexuality being an issue was completely removed from the DSM. This is so important because of the effect that it had on queer people's ability to openly live in this country. After homosexuality was no longer considered an illness, it opened the doors for us to gain many more of our rights, from guarantees on the prevention of workplace discrimination to the right to marry. I say this with the caveat that we still have a ways to go. If you haven't read this speech before, I highly recommend reading it. I will warn, however, that some of the language didn't age very well. It was very indicative of the times and also includes some strong language. That said, there is a grain of wisdom in there, and I think it's really important to mention. It's in the last line. Dr. Fryer said, "We must, therefore, use our skills to help patients and us to grow to be comfortable with that little piece of humanity called homosexuality." And there's the moral, folks. To be gay is to be human. This was an idea that was controversial at the time, and it's only in the last 50 years or so that the general public has really started to accept the idea. Queer people are human. Queer people can be happy. Queer people can be healthy. And yes, queer people are holy, as all people are holy. This has required and will continue to require a full community effort to try and understand each other and to accept each other for who we are until this problem goes away. It's going to take a lot of love. Now, I'd like to ask everybody in this room to raise your hand again, everybody this time. If you feel loved and accepted by this community for who you are, please keep your hand up. I'd like to give this opportunity for the elders in the room to look around at all these hands. You did that. So thank you. That is the power of love, folks. And for those of us who came after those elders, it's our job to keep it going. So remember, justice may be slow, but love wins.